The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Marine Sergeant Elena Rodriguez made her way through the marketplace. She had been deployed to this small town in Afghanistan for 8 months now, working as a combat medic with her unit. The locals had grown used to seeing her face, and some even smiled when she passed by their stalls, selling colorful fabrics and fresh bread. Elena never wore her uniform when she went on these walks. Instead, she dressed in simple civilian clothes, a long brown dress and a headscarf that helped her blend in with the women in the village. Her commanding officer had given her permission to do this because it helped her connect with the local people, especially the women and children who were often too scared to approach soldiers in full military gear. What the villagers didn't know was that Elena carried a small medical kit hidden under her dress. She had saved 3 lives in the past month just by being in the right place at the right time: a child who had fallen from a roof, an elderly man having a heart attack, and a woman who had cut herself badly while cooking. Each time, Elena had quietly helped without revealing who she really was. On this particular morning, Elena noticed something different. The usual chatter and laughter from the marketplace seemed quieter. People were glancing around nervously, and some shop owners were packing up their goods earlier than usual. She had learned to trust these signs after months of living among these people. Something was wrong. As she walked past a small tea shop, Elena heard the owner speaking urgently to his wife in their local language. She had picked up enough words over the months to understand that they were talking about strangers who had been asking questions about American soldiers. Her heart began to beat faster, but she kept walking at the same steady pace. Elena turned down a narrow alley between 2 buildings, planning to take her usual route back to the base. The alley was empty except for a few chickens pecking at scraps of food on the ground. She was halfway through when she heard voices behind her. 3 men were following her, and they were speaking in hushed tones. She could feel their eyes on her back as she continued walking. Elena's training kicked in, and she became aware of every sound around her. The men's footsteps were getting closer, and she could hear them whispering to each other. She recognized a few words. They were talking about taking someone alive for questioning. Elena's mind raced as she considered her options. She could run, but that would blow her cover and put the entire village at risk. She could try to lose them in the maze of alleys, but she didn't know this part of town well enough. Or she could continue acting like a normal civilian woman and hope they would leave her alone. As she reached the end of the alley, Elena made her decision. She would keep walking and see what happened. If these men were planning something, she needed to know what it was. Her unit was depending on her to gather information about any threats in the area. The main street was busier than the alley, with people going about their daily business. Elena felt slightly safer with more people around, but she could still sense the 3 men following her. She stopped at a fruit stand and pretended to examine the oranges while listening carefully to what was happening behind her. One of the men approached the fruit seller and asked him something in the local language. Elena caught enough words to understand that they were asking about her, whether she lived in the village and if anyone knew her family. The fruit seller shook his head and said he had never seen her before. Elena's blood ran cold. These men were definitely watching her, and they suspected she wasn't who she appeared to be. She bought 2 oranges and continued walking, her mind working quickly to figure out her next move. She needed to get back to base and report this, but she also needed to make sure these men didn't follow her there. As she walked through the crowded street, Elena noticed more signs that something big was happening. Several shops had their metal shutters pulled halfway down, and there were fewer children playing in the streets than usual. The local police officer, who usually stood at the main intersection, was nowhere to be seen. Elena decided to take a longer route back to base, hoping to lose her followers in the busy part of town. She turned left at the mosque and walked past the school where she had helped set up a small medical clinic the month before. Some of the teachers recognized her and waved, which made her feel a bit better, but when she glanced back, the 3 men were still there. They had spread out now, with one walking on each side of the street and one behind her. Elena realized they were using professional surveillance techniques. These weren't just local troublemakers. They were trained operatives. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. Elena knew she had to make a choice soon. She could try to confront them and risk a fight in the middle of the village, or she could continue her act and hope for an opportunity to escape. Either way, she was running out of time and options. As she approached the edge of the village where the American base was located, Elena made one final decision. She would continue to her usual stopping point, a small hill overlooking the base where she often sat to watch the sunset. If the men followed her there, she would have to reveal who she really was and fight her way out. The hill was only a few hundred meters away now, and Elena could see the American flag flying over the base in the distance. She had never been so happy to see that flag, but she also knew that the next few minutes would determine whether she made it home safely or became a prisoner of these mysterious men who had been hunting her through the village. Elena reached the small hill just as the afternoon call to prayer began echoing across the village. She sat down on a large rock where she always rested, trying to appear calm while her heart pounded in her chest. The three men had followed her here just as she had feared. They positioned themselves at different points around the hill, cutting off all her escape routes. From her position, Elena could see the American base clearly. The guards at the main gate were only about 400 meters away, but they might as well have been on the moon. If she ran toward the base now, the men would catch her before she got halfway there. If she called out for help, they would know for certain that she was an American soldier. One of the men started walking up the hill toward her. He was tall and thin, with a thick black beard and eyes that seemed to look right through her. Elena kept her head down and continued eating one of the oranges she had bought. Playing the part of a village woman taking a peaceful break from her daily work, the man stopped about 10 feet away from her and spoke in the local language. He asked her what village she was from and why she came to this hill every day. Elena answered in the broken local dialect she had learned, telling him she lived with her aunt and liked to watch the birds from here. Her voice didn't shake, even though her hands were trembling slightly. The man seemed satisfied with her answer at first, but then he asked another question that made Elena's stomach drop. He wanted to know why her hands looked so clean and soft if she worked in the fields like other village women. Elena looked down at her hands and realized he was right. Months of medical training and using surgical gloves had kept her hands much softer than those of the local women. Before Elena could answer, gunshots rang out from the direction of the village. Both she and the man turned to look, and Elena could see smoke rising from near the marketplace. The other two men who had been watching her immediately started running toward the sound of the fighting, leaving only the tall man to guard her. This was the moment Elena had been waiting for. With only one man watching her, she had a chance to escape, but as she started to stand up, the man pulled out a knife and told her to sit back down. He spoke in English this time, which confirmed Elena's worst fears. These men knew exactly who she was. The fighting in the village was getting louder. Elena could hear automatic weapons now, and she knew her unit was probably responding to whatever attack was happening. She needed to get back to help them, but first she had to deal with the man in front of her. Elena pretended to be confused by his English, asking him in the local language what he had said. The man smiled coldly and repeated his order to stay sitting, this time in her language. But Elena had noticed something important when he had pulled out his knife. He had favored his left side, suggesting an old injury. As they sat staring at each other, Elena could hear helicopters approaching from the direction of the base. The cavalry was coming, but they were heading to the village where the fighting was happening, not to this quiet hill where she was trapped. The man with the knife started talking on a small radio, speaking quickly in a language Elena didn't recognize. She caught a few words that sounded like Arabic, and realized he was probably talking to whoever was leading the attack on the village. When he finished his conversation, he looked at Elena with a satisfied expression. He told her in English that his friends were creating a distraction so they could capture her without interference. Elena's blood ran cold as she realized this entire attack had been planned around kidnapping her. Somehow, these men had figured out that she was an American medic who disguised herself as a local woman. Elena knew she was running out of time. The helicopters were getting closer to the village, which meant they would be busy dealing with the attack for at least another hour. She had to act now, before the man's backup arrived or before he decided to move her to a different location. As the man continued talking on his radio, Elena slowly reached under her dress for the small medical kit she always carried. Inside the kit, along with bandages and medicine, was a scalpel she used for emergency surgery. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. The sound of gunfire from the village suddenly stopped, which seemed to worry the man. He spoke more urgently into his radio, asking what was happening. Elena could tell from his tone that something wasn't going according to their plan. This was her chance. While the man was distracted by his radio conversation, Elena palmed the scalpel and slowly shifted her weight, preparing to spring into action. She had trained for situations like this during her military preparation, but she had never imagined she would have to use those skills while dressed as a village woman on a peaceful hill. The man finished his radio call and looked back at Elena with angry eyes. He told her that there had been a problem with their operation, and they needed to move immediately. He ordered her to stand up and walk down the other side of the hill, away from the American base. Elena stood up slowly, keeping the scalpel hidden in her right hand. As she took her first step toward him, she stumbled slightly as if she was scared and clumsy. The man relaxed slightly, thinking she was just a frightened civilian woman who would be easy to control. That was his mistake. Elena had been one of the best hand-to-hand combat students in her training class, and she had learned never to underestimate the element of surprise. As the man reached out to grab her arm and guide her down the hill, Elena spun around and struck with the precision of a trained soldier. The scalpel found its mark in the man's shoulder, and he dropped his knife with a cry of pain and surprise. Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed his radio and threw it as hard as she could against a rock, smashing it into pieces. Then she started running toward the base as fast as her legs could carry her. Behind her, she could hear the man shouting in multiple languages, calling for help and cursing her escape. Elena didn't look back as she ran down the hill, her long dress making it difficult to move quickly. She could see the guards at the base gate now, and they had noticed her running toward them. But Elena knew the danger wasn't over yet. The man she had wounded would probably try to follow her, and his two companions might be returning from the village at any moment. She still had 300 meters to cover before she reached safety, and a lot could happen in that distance. Elena ran harder than she had ever run in her life. The loose gravel on the hillside made her slip several times, but she managed to keep her balance and continue toward the base. Behind her, she could hear the wounded man still shouting, and now she could see two figures running toward the hill from the direction of the village. His companions were returning. As she got closer to the base, Elena could see the guards at the gate raising their weapons and shouting at her to stop. From their perspective, she looked like a local woman running toward their position, which could mean anything from a suicide attack to a civilian seeking help. Elena knew she had to identify herself quickly before they shot her as a potential threat. When she was about 50 meters from the gate, Elena shouted in English that she was Sergeant Rodriguez and needed immediate assistance. The guards immediately recognized her voice even though they had never seen her in civilian clothes before. Two of them ran out to meet her while the others maintained their defensive positions. Elena reached the first guard just as gunshots rang out behind her. The wounded man had apparently found his knife and was now shooting at her with a pistol, though his aim was poor because of his injury. The guards immediately returned fire while pulling Elena behind the concrete barriers that protected the gate. As soon as Elena was safe behind cover, she tried to catch her breath and explain what had happened. The guard commander, Sergeant Mike Torres, was someone she had worked with many times during medical emergencies. He listened carefully as Elena quickly described the three men who had been following her and the attack on the village. Torres immediately got on his radio to report Elena's information to the base commander. Within minutes, Elena could hear vehicles starting up inside the base as a quick reaction force prepared to respond to the situation. But Torres told Elena that she needed to stay at the gate area until the base security team could debrief her properly. Elena looked back toward the hill and saw that the three men had disappeared. They had probably retreated when they realized Elena had reached safety and that American soldiers were now shooting back at them, but Elena knew this wasn't over. These men had planned their operation too carefully to give up so easily. As they waited for the security team, Torres asked Elena how the men had identified her as an American soldier. Elena had been thinking about the same question during her run to safety. She realized it could have been any number of small things: her posture, the way she walked, her reaction to certain sounds, or even the fact that she visited the same hill every day at the same time. The security team arrived within 10 minutes, led by Captain Sarah Mitchell, the base intelligence officer. Captain Mitchell had been trying to identify potential threats in the area for months, and Elena's information was exactly what she needed to understand the bigger picture of what was happening. Captain Mitchell asked Elena to describe everything she could remember about the three men, from their physical appearance to the languages they spoke and the equipment they carried. Elena's medical training had taught her to be observant and precise, so she was able to provide detailed descriptions that would help identify the men later. The most important information Elena provided was about the radio conversation she had overheard. The fact that the attack on the village had been planned as a distraction meant there was a larger organization operating in the area, not just random insurgents causing trouble. As Elena finished her report, explosions could be heard from the direction of the village. Captain Mitchell explained that the Quick Reaction Force had found several improvised explosive devices that had been planted during the attack. The whole operation had been much more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. Elena asked if she could join the medical team that was probably treating wounded civilians in the village, but Captain Mitchell told her she needed to stay on base for now. The men who had tried to capture her were still out there, and it wouldn't be safe for her to leave the base until the area was completely secured. While they waited for more information from the village, Captain Mitchell asked Elena about her civilian disguise and her daily routine. Elena explained that she had permission from her commanding officer to dress as a local woman because it helped her provide medical care to villagers who were afraid of soldiers. Captain? Mitchell nodded but looked concerned. She told Elena that while her humanitarian work was valuable, it had also made her a target. The enemy had obviously been watching her for some time, learning her patterns and planning the best way to capture her. Elena felt a mixture of guilt and frustration. She had been trying to help people, but her actions had apparently put not only herself but also the entire village at risk. The attack that had just happened might never have occurred if she hadn't been walking through the marketplace in disguise. Captain Mitchell seemed to read Elena's thoughts and assured her that she had done nothing wrong. The intelligence they had gathered from her experience would help protect other soldiers and civilians in the future. But she also made it clear that Elena's days of walking through the village in civilian clothes were over. As the afternoon wore on, reports came back from the village. The Quick Reaction Force had secured the area and found evidence that the attackers had been planning their operation for weeks. They had rented a house on the outskirts of the village and had been watching the American base's daily routines. Most importantly, the force had captured one of the men who had been following Elena. Under questioning, he had revealed that their mission was to kidnap an American medic and use her as leverage in negotiations with the U.S. military. Elena realized how close she had come to becoming a political prisoner. The captured man also revealed that the organization behind the operation was much larger than anyone had suspected. They had cells operating in several villages throughout the region, all focused on gathering intelligence about American operations and looking for opportunities to capture high-value targets. Elena's escape had not only saved her own life but had also provided crucial intelligence that would help protect other soldiers throughout the region. Captain Mitchell told her that her quick thinking and combat training had prevented what could have been a major international incident. As the sun began to set, Elena finally felt safe enough to relax slightly. But she also knew that her role in this deployment had changed permanently. She would no longer be able to provide medical care to the local villagers in the way she had been doing, and that knowledge made her feel sad despite her relief at being safe. The base commander, Colonel James Anderson, arrived at the gate area to personally thank Elena for her actions and to discuss how the medical mission would continue going forward. Elena realized that while this particular danger was over, her war was far from finished. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's escape from the hill, and life on the base had settled into a new routine. Elena no longer left the base in civilian clothes, and her medical work was now limited to treating soldiers and the occasional civilian who came to the base seeking help. She missed her daily walks through the village, but she understood why they were no longer possible. The intelligence gathered from Elena's encounter had led to several successful operations against the terrorist cell that had been operating in the region. 2 more members of the group had been captured, and their safe house had been raided. But Captain Mitchell warned Elena that the leader of the group was still free, and probably planning revenge. On this particular morning, Elena was working in the base medical clinic when Sergeant Torres burst through the door with urgent news. A convoy of American vehicles had been attacked on the main road between two villages, and there were multiple casualties. The base's helicopters were already on their way to evacuate the wounded, but they would need all available medical personnel to treat them. Elena immediately began preparing the clinic for mass casualties. She set up additional beds, organized medical supplies, and briefed the other medics on triage procedures. This was what she had trained for during all those months of medical school and military preparation, saving lives under pressure. The first helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, carrying 3 wounded soldiers. Elena quickly assessed their injuries and began treating the most serious case, a young private who had taken shrapnel to his chest and was having trouble breathing. As she worked to stabilize him, more helicopters arrived with additional casualties. Among the wounded was Staff Sergeant David Kim, a soldier Elena had treated several times for minor injuries. But this time his wounds were much more serious. He had been the convoy commander when the attack happened, and he was blaming himself for not seeing the ambush coming. Elena worked on his injured leg while trying to keep him calm and focused. As Elena treated the wounded soldiers, she couldn't help but think about the villagers who might have been caught in the crossfire during the attack. The road where the convoy had been hit ran right through a small farming community, and Elena knew there were families living in houses along that route. After Elena had stabilized all the wounded soldiers, Captain Mitchell arrived with disturbing news. The attack on the convoy hadn't been random. It had been specifically designed to draw American helicopters and medical personnel away from the base. Intelligence reports suggested that another attack was being planned, possibly targeting the base itself. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she realized what this meant. The terrorist leader who had escaped capture was still trying to get revenge for his failed kidnapping operation. He was using wounded American soldiers as bait to create an opportunity for a larger attack. Colonel Anderson called an emergency meeting for all senior personnel, including Elena because of her unique experience with the terrorist cell. In the briefing room, Captain Mitchell presented satellite images showing unusual activity in several locations around the base. Groups of armed men had been spotted moving toward positions that would give them clear shots at the base's helicopter landing pad. The colonel explained that they faced a difficult choice. They could ground the helicopters and refuse to respond to calls for medical evacuation, which would protect the base but leave wounded soldiers stranded in the field. Or they could continue medical missions while knowing they might be flying into traps. Elena raised her hand and suggested a third option. She proposed that they continue the medical missions but change their procedures to make them less predictable. Instead of always landing at the main helipad, the helicopters could use alternate landing sites. Medical teams could be pre-positioned at different locations to reduce response times. Colonel Anderson liked Elena's suggestions, but he pointed out that implementing them would require medical personnel to be stationed outside the main base, which would put them at greater risk. Elena volunteered to be part of these forward medical teams, arguing that her experience with the terrorist cell made her the most qualified person for the job. Captain Mitchell objected strongly to Elena's proposal. She reminded everyone that Elena was specifically being hunted by the terrorist leader, and putting her in a forward position would be like offering her as a gift to their enemies. But Elena argued that hiding on the base hadn't stopped the terrorist from targeting American convoys and trying to draw her into the open. The debate continued for over an hour, with various officers presenting different arguments about the best way to handle the situation. Finally, Colonel Anderson made his decision. They would implement Elena's plan, but with additional security measures and a backup extraction plan in case things went wrong. Elena spent the rest of the day preparing for her new assignment. She would be stationed at a small outpost about 15 kilometers from the main base, along with 2 other medics and a security team of 8 soldiers. Their job would be to provide immediate medical care to wounded personnel before evacuating them to the main base for surgery. As Elena packed her medical supplies, she thought about how much her life had changed since that morning. 3 weeks ago, when she had been walking peacefully through the village marketplace, she had gone from being a disguised medic trying to help civilians to being the target of a sophisticated terrorist operation. Sergeant Torres helped Elena load her equipment into the helicopter that would take her to the outpost. He reminded her to stay alert and follow all security procedures, but Elena could see the worry in his eyes. Everyone knew this assignment was dangerous, but it was also necessary to protect other soldiers who might be wounded in future attacks. The flight to the outpost took only 10 minutes, but Elena used the time to review the medical protocols they would be following and to study maps of the area. The outpost was located on a small hill that provided good visibility in all directions, and it had been chosen specifically because it would be difficult for enemies to approach without being seen. When Elena arrived at the outpost, she was greeted by Lieutenant Maria Santos, the officer in charge of the security team. Lieutenant Santos briefed Elena on the defensive positions and escape routes, emphasizing that medical personnel were the top priority for evacuation if the outpost came under attack. As Elena set up her medical station, she realized that this assignment would test everything she had learned during her deployment. She would need to combine her medical skills with the combat awareness she had developed during her months in Afghanistan. Most importantly, she would need to stay focused on saving lives while knowing that enemies were actively hunting for her. The sun was setting as Elena finished preparing her medical equipment. She looked out over the valley below and saw lights beginning to come on in the scattered farmhouses and villages. Somewhere out there, the terrorist leader was probably planning his next move. Elena knew that the next few days would determine whether her plan to save wounded soldiers would succeed, or whether she would become a prisoner of the very people she was trying to help protect others from. Elena had been at the outpost for 2 days when the first test of their new medical system came. At 3 in the morning, she was awakened by the sound of Lieutenant Santos shouting orders to her security team. A patrol had been attacked about 8 kilometers away, and they had 2 wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. Elena quickly put on her gear and prepared her medical supplies while the security team established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. The helicopter arrived within 15 minutes, carrying a young corporal with a severe leg wound and a sergeant who had taken shrapnel to his arm and shoulder. Working by the light of tactical flashlights, Elena assessed both soldiers' injuries and began treatment immediately. The corporal's wound was bleeding heavily, and Elena had to work quickly to stop the bleeding and stabilize him before he could be evacuated to the main base for surgery. The sergeant's injuries were less serious, but Elena found several pieces of metal embedded in his shoulder that needed to be removed. As Elena worked on the wounded soldiers, she could hear Lieutenant Santos talking on the radio with the main base. The attack on the patrol had been well planned and executed, suggesting that the terrorist cell was still active and targeting American soldiers. Even more concerning, the attackers had disappeared completely after the ambush, which meant they knew the terrain extremely well. Elena successfully stabilized both wounded soldiers and had them evacuated to the main base within an hour of their arrival at the outpost. As she cleaned up her medical equipment, she felt satisfied that their new system was working. The soldiers had received life-saving treatment much faster than would have been possible if they had been taken directly to the main base. But Elena's satisfaction was short-lived. The next morning, Lieutenant Santos received intelligence reports indicating that the outpost location had been discovered by hostile forces. Surveillance drones had spotted groups of armed men moving through the valleys around their position, apparently conducting reconnaissance for a future attack. Colonel Anderson contacted the outpost by radio and offered to evacuate Elena and the medical team immediately. But Elena argued that pulling back now would send a message to the terrorists that their intimidation tactics were working. She proposed that they stay at the outpost, but increase security measures and prepare for the possibility of an attack. Lieutenant Santos supported Elena's decision, but she insisted on calling in additional reinforcements from the main base. By evening, their security team had been doubled, and they had received additional ammunition and defensive equipment. Elena helped the soldiers set up medical stations at multiple locations around the outpost so that wounded defenders could be treated quickly if they came under attack. Elena spent the night checking and rechecking her medical supplies, making sure she had everything she might need for a mass casualty situation. She had treated wounded soldiers many times before, but she had never had to do it while under direct enemy fire. The prospect was terrifying, but Elena knew that her training and experience would see her through. The attack came just before dawn on Elena's 4th day at the outpost. Lieutenant Santos was awakened by one of her sentries reporting movement in the valley below. Through night vision equipment, They could see at least 20 armed men moving toward the outpost from 3 different directions. The terrorists had surrounded them and were preparing for a coordinated assault. Lieutenant Santos immediately contacted the main base and requested emergency reinforcements, but she was told that the nearest available helicopters were responding to another attack on the far side of the region. The outpost would have to hold out on its own for at least an hour before help could arrive. Elena took her position at the central medical station as the first shots rang out. The terrorists were using automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades, trying to overwhelm the outpost's defenses through sheer firepower. Lieutenant Santos's soldiers returned fire from their defensive positions, but Elena could tell from the sound of the gunfire that they were heavily outnumbered. The first wounded soldier arrived at Elena's position within minutes of the start of the attack. Private Johnson had been hit by rifle fire in his left arm, and Elena quickly applied a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. As she worked on Johnson's wound, she could hear Lieutenant Santos shouting orders to her soldiers and calling for artillery support from the main base. More wounded soldiers began arriving at Elena's station as the battle intensified. Elena worked frantically to treat their injuries while bullets flew overhead and explosions shook the ground around her. She had never experienced anything like this before, but her training kept her focused on the task of saving lives. Sergeant Williams arrived at the medical station with a serious chest wound, and Elena realized she would need to perform emergency surgery to save his life. Working in a shallow trench while under enemy fire, Elena opened Williams's chest and repaired a punctured lung. It was the most challenging medical procedure she had ever attempted, but Williams's breathing improved immediately after the surgery. As Elena worked on Sergeant Williams, she noticed that the enemy fire was becoming more accurate. The terrorists had apparently brought snipers who were targeting specific positions around the outpost. Lieutenant Santos reported that they had lost contact with 2 of their defensive positions and weren't sure if the soldiers there were dead or just unable to communicate. Elena made a decision that would change everything. She told Lieutenant Santos that she was going to crawl to the silent defensive positions to check for wounded soldiers. Santos tried to stop her, arguing that it was too dangerous, but Elena pointed out that those soldiers would die if they didn't receive medical attention soon. Carrying only a small medical kit, Elena crawled out of her protected position and began making her way toward the first silent defensive position. Bullets whistled over her head as she moved, and she had to stop several times when explosions sent dirt and rocks flying around her. When Elena reached the first position, she found 2 soldiers who had been wounded by a grenade explosion. Both men were unconscious and bleeding heavily. Elena quickly assessed their injuries and began treatment, knowing that she was completely exposed to enemy fire while she worked. As Elena treated the wounded soldiers, she could hear the terrorists getting closer to the outpost. Their voices were louder now, and she could hear them calling to each other in multiple languages as they coordinated their attack. Elena realized that the outpost's defenders were running out of ammunition and wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. Elena had just finished stabilizing the 2 wounded soldiers when she heard helicopter rotors in the distance. The reinforcements from the main base were finally arriving, but Elena wasn't sure if they would get there in time to save the outpost. The sound of the approaching helicopters seemed to energize the terrorists, who began firing even more intensively at the outpost. Elena could see muzzle flashes all around her position as she prepared to move the wounded soldiers to safety. She realized that the next few minutes would determine whether she and the soldiers she was trying to save would survive this battle. The helicopters arrived, just as Elena was dragging the second wounded soldier toward safety. She could see the aircraft approaching from the east, their door gunners already firing at the terrorist positions surrounding the outpost. The sound of their heavy machine guns was like music to Elena's ears as she continued pulling the unconscious soldier across the rocky ground. Lieutenant Santos's voice crackled over the radio, coordinating the helicopter attack with her remaining defenders. Elena could hear the relief in Santos's voice as she directed the aircraft toward the heaviest concentrations of enemy fighters. The terrorists had been caught in the open when the helicopters arrived, and many of them were now scrambling for cover. Elena managed to get both wounded soldiers back to her medical station, just as the first helicopter landed in the center of the outpost. A squad of fresh soldiers jumped out and immediately took up defensive positions while the helicopter's crew chief helped Elena load the most seriously wounded onto stretchers. As the first helicopter lifted off with the wounded. Elena could see that the battle was turning in their favor. The terrorist attack had been broken by the arrival of the reinforcements, and many of the attackers were now retreating toward the valleys below the outpost. But Elena also noticed that some of the terrorists were regrouping in a cluster of buildings about 500 meters away. The second helicopter had landed and was taking on more wounded soldiers, when Elena heard Lieutenant Santos shouting a warning. Through her binoculars, Santos had spotted armed men setting up what looked like a large mortar in one of the distant buildings. If the terrorists managed to get that weapon operational, they could shell the outpost from a safe distance. Elena watched as Lieutenant Santos called for immediate air support to destroy the mortar position, but she was told that the attack helicopters were still 20 minutes away. The terrorists would have their weapon ready long before then, and they would be able to target the landing zone where the medical helicopters were still evacuating wounded soldiers. Without thinking about the danger, Elena grabbed her medical kit and ran toward Lieutenant Santos's command position. She told Santos that she had an idea, but it would require someone to get close enough to the terrorist position to call in accurate artillery fire. Santos immediately rejected the idea, saying it would be suicide for anyone to leave the outpost's protective perimeter. Elena argued that she was the only person who could do it successfully. Her experience walking through hostile territory in civilian disguise had taught her how to move without being detected, and her medical training had given her the precise observation skills needed to call in accurate fire missions. Lieutenant Santos stared at Elena for a long moment, clearly torn between the desperate need to stop the mortar and the responsibility to protect her medical personnel. Finally, Santos agreed to let Elena attempt the mission, but only if she took 2 soldiers with her for protection and maintained constant radio contact. Elena quickly gathered the equipment she would need: a powerful radio, binoculars, and a small weapon for self-defense. She also took her medical kit, knowing that she might encounter wounded soldiers or civilians during the mission. 2 experienced soldiers, Corporal Martinez and Private Chen, volunteered to accompany her on what everyone knew was an extremely dangerous assignment. The 3 of them left the outpost through a concealed exit on the side facing away from the terrorist mortar position. Elena led the way, using the terrain knowledge she had gained during her months of walking through the local area. They moved carefully from rock to rock, staying low and avoiding open ground where they might be spotted. As they got closer to the buildings where the terrorists were setting up their mortar, Elena could hear voices and the sound of metal equipment being assembled. Through her binoculars, she could see at least 6 armed men working frantically to get their weapon ready. They had chosen their position well. The building provided good cover from the outpost while giving them a clear line of fire. Elena found a position about 200 meters from the terrorist location that provided good visibility while keeping her team hidden behind a large boulder. She set up her radio and began calling in precise coordinates to the artillery unit at the main base. The first shells would arrive in less than 5 minutes, but Elena needed to make sure her targeting information was perfect. As Elena fine-tuned her coordinates, Corporal Martinez spotted movement to their left. A group of terrorists who had been retreating from the outpost battle were moving toward their position, apparently planning to regroup with the mortar team. Elena's small team was about to be caught between 2 groups of enemies. Elena made a quick decision. She told Martinez and Chen to take defensive positions while she continued calling in the artillery strike. The mortar had to be destroyed before it could fire on the helicopters that were still evacuating wounded soldiers from the outpost. Elena's mission was more important than her own safety. The approaching terrorists spotted Elena's team just as the first artillery shells began falling on the mortar position. Elena watched through her binoculars as the building containing the mortar exploded in a shower of debris and flame. The terrorist weapon had been destroyed, but now her team was trapped between the survivors of the mortar crew and the group that had been approaching from the side. Gunfire erupted around Elena's position as both groups of terrorists began shooting at her team. Martinez and Chen returned fire, while Elena continued to observe the target area, making sure the mortar had been completely destroyed. She could see bodies in the rubble of the collapsed building, but she also spotted at least 3 terrorists who had survived the artillery strike and were now moving toward her position. Elena realized that her team needed to retreat immediately, but the route back to the outpost was now blocked by the surviving terrorists. She studied the terrain around their position and identified an alternate route that would take them through a dry riverbed, but it would require them to cross about 50 meters of open ground while under fire. As Elena prepared to lead her team toward the riverbed, she heard the sound of helicopters approaching again. Looking up, she saw 2 attack helicopters racing toward their position. Lieutenant Santos had apparently called in close air support to help extract Elena's team from their dangerous situation. The attack helicopters opened fire on both groups of terrorists with their cannons and rockets, forcing the enemy fighters to take cover and stopping their advance toward Elena's position. During the confusion created by the helicopter attack, Elena led Martinez and Chen in a desperate sprint toward the riverbed. They had almost reached safety when Elena heard Chen cry out behind her. Turning around, she saw that the young soldier had been hit in the leg and was struggling to keep up. Without hesitation, Elena ran back to help him, even though bullets were still flying around them. Elena quickly examined Chen's wound and applied a field dressing to stop the bleeding. The bullet had missed the major blood vessels, but Chen wouldn't be able to walk without assistance. Elena and Martinez would have to carry him the rest of the way back to the outpost. As they helped Chen toward the riverbed, Elena could see that the helicopter attack had scattered the terrorists, but hadn't eliminated them completely. Small groups of enemy fighters were still moving through the area, and Elena's team would have to be extremely careful during their return journey. To avoid being captured or killed, the 3 soldiers reached the riverbed just as Elena's radio crackled with a message from Lieutenant Santos. The outpost had been secured and all the wounded had been successfully evacuated. Elena's mission to destroy the mortar had saved the lives of the soldiers who had been waiting for medical evacuation, but Elena's own survival was still in doubt. She and her team were still deep in hostile territory, with wounded soldiers who couldn't walk and limited ammunition for their weapons. The attack helicopters had moved on to engage other terrorist positions, leaving Elena's team to make their way back to the outpost on foot through enemy-controlled terrain. Elena and her team spent 2 hours making their way back to the outpost through the dry riverbed. They moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to listen for enemy movement and to check on Private Chen's condition. Elena had to change his bandages twice during the journey, but the bleeding had stopped and he remained conscious despite the pain. As they approached the final stretch before the outpost, Elena heard familiar voices calling their names. Lieutenant Santos had sent out a search team to find them, and Elena felt overwhelming relief when she saw friendly faces emerging from behind the rocks ahead of them. The nightmare was finally over. Back at the outpost, Elena immediately went to work treating the soldiers who had been wounded during the battle. In addition to the men she had already helped, 3 more soldiers had been injured during the final helicopter assault on the terrorist positions. Elena worked for hours cleaning wounds, removing shrapnel, and preparing soldiers for evacuation to the main base. Colonel Anderson arrived at the outpost that evening to personally debrief Elena and Lieutenant Santos about the battle. He brought news that the artillery strike Elena had called in had not only destroyed the mortar, but had also killed the terrorist leader who had been hunting her for weeks. The man's body had been identified among the casualties in the collapsed building. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions when she heard this news. She was relieved that the immediate threat to her safety was over, but she also felt sad that the situation had escalated to the point where so many people had died. She wondered if there might have been a peaceful solution that could have prevented all the violence. Colonel Anderson explained that intelligence gathered from the battle had revealed the full extent of the terrorist network that had been operating in the region. Elena's escape from the original kidnapping attempt had triggered a series of events that ultimately led to the destruction of the entire organization. Her actions had probably saved the lives of many soldiers and civilians who would have been targeted in future attacks. Over the following days, Elena continued her medical work at the outpost, but the atmosphere had changed completely. With the terrorist threat eliminated, local villagers began approaching the outpost to request medical assistance for their families. Elena was finally able to resume the humanitarian work that had originally brought her into contact with the terrorists. Elena established a schedule where villagers could bring sick or injured family members to the outpost for treatment. She worked with interpreters to communicate with patients who didn't speak English, and she trained some of the local women in basic first aid techniques. It was the kind of work Elena had always wanted to do, but now she could do it safely within the protection of the military outpost. One morning, Elena was treating a young girl who had been burned in a cooking accident when an elderly woman approached her with tears in her eyes. Through the interpreter, the woman explained that Elena had once helped her grandson when he had fallen from a roof in the village marketplace. The woman had recognized Elena despite the fact that she was now wearing military uniform. Instead of civilian clothes, the woman told Elena that the entire village knew she was the American medic who had risked her life to help local people. She said that many families had been praying for Elena's safety after they learned about the attempts to kidnap her. Elena was deeply moved by this unexpected show of support from people she had been trying to help. As weeks passed, Elena's reputation spread to other villages in the region. People traveled for hours to bring their sick relatives to her clinic at the outpost. Elena realized that her work was having a much greater impact than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just treating individual patients. She was building trust between the American military and the local population. Elena's commanding officer eventually recommended her for a medal recognizing her courage during the battle at the outpost and her ongoing humanitarian work. But Elena felt that the real reward was seeing families reunited with loved ones she had helped save, and knowing that her medical skills were making a real difference in people's lives. 3 months after the battle, Elena received orders transferring her to a larger medical facility in Germany. Her tour of duty in Afghanistan was coming to an end, and she would soon be returning to the United States. Elena felt mixed emotions about leaving. She was excited to see her family again, but she would miss the meaningful work she had been doing. On her last day at the outpost, dozens of villagers came to say goodbye to Elena. They brought gifts of food and handmade items, and many of the women she had treated hugged her and thanked her in broken English. Elena realized that these relationships she had built would be the most lasting impact of her deployment. Lieutenant Santos organized a farewell ceremony for Elena at the outpost. The soldiers who had served with her presented her with a plaque commemorating her service, and several of the men whose lives she had saved spoke about what her medical care had meant to them and their families. As Elena boarded the helicopter that would take her to the main base for her flight home, she looked back at the outpost where she had faced some of the most challenging and dangerous moments of her life. She thought about how much she had grown as both a medic and a person during her time in Afghanistan. Elena knew that her experiences had changed her forever. She had learned that being a military medic meant much more than just treating wounded soldiers. It meant building bridges between cultures, showing compassion in the face of hostility, and never giving up hope even in the darkest situations. As the helicopter lifted off and the outpost disappeared below her, Elena began planning for her future. She wanted to use the skills and experience she had gained in Afghanistan to continue helping people who needed medical care. Whether in the military or as a civilian, Elena knew that her mission to save lives and heal wounds would continue for the rest of her career. The young woman who had once walked disguised through village marketplaces had become a decorated combat medic whose courage and compassion had touched the lives of hundreds of people. Elena's story was proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from the simple act of caring for those who are suffering and refusing to let fear prevent you from doing what is right.